Zombies. For the majority of the lifetime of cinema, if you thought of a zombie, it was probably like this. A revivified corpse under the sway of a voodoo priest or priestess. Mindless undead drones doing the bidding of their living masters. Just as the majority of societal norms began to crumble in the late 1960s, so too did the image of what a zombie could be. The year was 1968 specifically, and the freshman filmmaker who would reimagine zombies forever can be seen here as an inquisitive reporter trying to discover the root of their origin. That's George A. Romero. The film is Night of the Living Dead.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
As it turns out, they were coming for all of us. Though it would take more than 3 decades and another puzzle piece to lock zombies firmly into the public consciousness. Prior to 1985, the number of films with a zombie menace can be clocked in at nearly 70. Since then, there have been some 500 zombie feature films. That doesn't even take into consideration the comic books, novels, television shows, all dedicated to the 21st century's first genuine boogeyman, the zombie. That missing puzzle piece was released on August 16, 1985, The Return of the Living Dead. At its heart, the film is a love story about Freddy, a nascent punk and recently hired employee at Unita Medical Supply, where he is training under the tutelage of the company's foreman Frank, and Tina, more suburban bubblegum pop than punk, who's spending the afternoon with Freddy's friends as they wait for him to get off work. Prodded by Freddy to relate the strangest thing he's seen in the medical supply industry, Frank tells a tale of how the film Night of the Living Dead was based on real events at a Pittsburgh VA hospital involving the chemical 2,4,5-trioxin and its ability to resurrect the dead. Even better, the bodies of those zombies were accidentally shipped to Unita and are stored in the basement. Things don't go well. Speaking of Night of the Living Dead, at the end of that film's production, the film's co-writers, George A. Romero and John Russo, made an agreement that they would each be allowed to produce a sequel. Romero would go on to create the masterpiece Dawn of the Dead, which saw a continuation of the zombie outbreak through the eyes of all new protagonists. Russo would later collaborate with 2 other Night alums, Russ Streiner and Rudy Ricci, to create a script and novel entitled Return of the Living Dead, a story set 10 years after the isolated zombie outbreak as it begins to occur again, featuring returning characters and locations from Night. That script was to be made by Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper, in 3D, with a total rewrite by a man who was already infamous in both sci-fi and horror, Dan O'Bannon. O'Bannon's film career officially began in 1974 with a student film at USC that was expanded to feature length and released in theaters. Dark Star, a film which he not only co-wrote, provided the production design, and oversaw the visual effects, but co-starred in as well. The ensuing years would see him as an author of numerous scripts and stories, one of which became an absolute phenomenon that is still relevant today, Alien. He would also provide the best segment of the animated anthology Heavy Metal, B-17. Originally conceived as a World War II bomber besieged by gremlins, the story morphed into a tale of the undead, wholly appropriate considering what would follow. Initially balking at the idea of rewriting a script that took place in a world already shaped and shepherded so skillfully by Romero, a professional courtesy most would abandon in later years, O'Bannon chose to take the zombies in a new direction, simultaneously commenting on what had come before and creating an entirely fresh mythology. Unita is conveniently located beside the aptly named Resurrection Cemetery, where Freddy's friends have chosen to wait for him. Across the graveyard is the only other business in this rundown section of St. Louis, the Resurrection Mortuary, run by Ernie Kaltenbrunner, a good friend of Unita's owner, Bert. When the trioxin gas reanimates a cadaver in the Unita freezer, Freddy, Bert, and Frank press Ernie to incinerate it in his crematorium, though they are unaware of the darkening skies above and the chemical nightmare they are about to unleash. With the trioxin-infused rain seeping into the ground, the cemetery becomes a breeding ground for the undead. But unlike nearly every incarnation before or since, destroying the brain has no effect at all. These zombies are vocal, fast, smart, and they're hungry.
Why do you eat people?
Not people. Brains.
It would take 10 of these videos to adequately illuminate not only the excellent performances throughout The Return of the Living Dead, but the fascinating careers of the performers themselves. And it should go without saying that brilliant character actor James Karen is one you should seek out at every opportunity. But let's focus on a few of the lesser known, starting with my favorite character, Suicide. Mark Venturini was a natural athlete, goaded into drama by a high school English teacher, where he played Hawkeye Pierce in a production of MASH, a performance I would pay any amount of money to see. He spent his career playing assorted thugs and strong-armed tough guys, with standout performances in films like Friday the 13th Part 5. There's a playful malevolence to his performance in return, and he delivers what must easily be the best line.
What do you think this is all about? You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
Chuck, the punk hipster, is played by John Philbin. He'd go on to star as Nathaniel, the surfing bank robber in Point Break, but is probably best known as Turtle, a local surfer in the cult film North Shore. If you're sensing a pattern here, it's because Philbin is an accomplished surfer in his own right, and now splits his time between performing and teaching actors to surf for films like Blue Crush and Soul Surfer. Incidentally, the voice of that half-corpse belongs to Cherry Davis. While her film credits are slim, the best known being the voice of Woody Woodpecker in Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Or a pussy.
She had a long and illustrious career on television and stage, beginning in the early 1960s, where she co-starred in many of Bob Fosse's productions. While there have been a plethora of memorable zombies over the years, The Return of the Living Dead features perhaps the most frightening of all time. This shambling, dripping nightmare, known as the Tar Man. With the hope of rescue swallowed up by each successive attack on police and paramedics, those in the mortuary have an even more pressing problem than the screaming dead outside. Frank and Freddy, having inhaled the trioxin gas, are already dead and have been for some time. Freddy and Tina's reunion is short-lived as he succumbs to the inevitable and no longer craves her affection, but her living human brain. Hold on. Take a look at Freddy's jacket in this scene. It represents a rumor surrounding the film that I, for one, certainly hope is true. When informed that any scene with Freddy's jacket in sight would be cut from the television version, Dan O'Bannon had a second jacket made that instead read simply, television version. Just when I thought I couldn't love O'Bannon more. Recognizing his own transformation, Frank, in a truly heartbreaking moment, sacrifices himself in the crematorium, set to Rocky Erickson's mournful, weird, and wonderful song, Burn the Flames. That's one of nearly a dozen songs featured throughout the film, providing a perfect alternate playlist to a year that was dominated musically by the likes of Tears for Fears, Phil Collins, and USA for Africa's We Are the World. The soundtrack album reads like a who's who of punk luminaries, featuring the likes of TSOL, SSQ, 45 Grave, who'd provide the anthemic tune Party Time, used heavily in the film's advertising. And easily my favorite, Surfin' Dead, from Psychobilly Pioneers' The Cramps. That song is used twice in the film, once during the scene where our heroes are barricading themselves in, and again during the closing credits. A word about those credits. They use a rarely employed technique of greatest hits moments playing in the background, although here it's the funniest moments in the film, at times recut to increase the humorous nature, and has helped convincing most viewers that The Return of the Living Dead is a comedy. Now don't get me wrong, it is a very funny film, and wildly quotable.
Man, what a hideous, ugly place.
I like it. It's a statement.
But this is a horror film first and foremost. With the blackest of hearts beating at its center, it spirals down into darkness in ways most horror films tend, in their closing moments, to veer away from. It's uncompromising, terrifying, and devoid of hope. There have been dozens of films since the punk explosion of the mid-70s, attempting to capture the spirit and feeling of its ethos. And there have been some successes to varying degree. But over the last 20 years, with the music reduced to pop, and the styling now just another fashion statement, it's easy to overlook a prime component of the culture itself, nihilism. The to hell with everything attitude derived from a feeling that the end was nigh. No future, as the Sex Pistols themselves proclaimed loud and proud on their debut album. The Return of the Living Dead is, well, not a living and breathing embodiment, but definitely the best film to encapsulate every aspect of punk rock. It has style, it has attitude, and it has nihilism to spare. And it's one you definitely need to see.
Bert, Frank, we have a little problem.